There are moments in life when everything you built over decades gets reduced to a signature on a piece of paper. Not a fight, not a dramatic confrontation, just a pen moving across a line, and then it is done. Loretta Vane had imagined this day many times over the past 2 years. She had imagined herself falling apart in the hallway outside the courtroom. She had imagined breaking down in the car afterward, hands shaking too hard to drive. She had imagined all the ways grief might finally catch up with her. What she had not imagined was how quiet it would be. The Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah stood the way it always had, heavy and indifferent, its marble floors reflecting the gray morning light that pushed through the tall windows. The ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. A clerk typed something at a desk without looking up. A man in a brown jacket waited on a bench near the door reading a folded newspaper. None of them knew. None of them cared. The ordinary world continued at its ordinary pace while Loretta Vane signed away 29 years of her life. She was 65 years old. She wore the same navy wool coat she had worn to funerals and graduations and every serious occasion in between. Her silver hair was pulled back the way it always was, practical and clean. Her posture was straight, her hands were steady, and the pen she held moved without hesitation across every line the attorney indicated. Across the table, Gareth Vane sat in a charcoal suit with a tie the color of slate. He was 67 years old and still carried himself like a man who believed rooms reorganized themselves around his presence. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His jaw was set. He did not look at Loretta as she signed. He looked at the papers the way a man looks at a transaction he has already mentally closed. His attorney, a thin man named Hollis Tate, spoke in the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news without inflection. He named assets. He named accounts. He named the house on Forsyth Park with its live oak in the front yard and its kitchen where Loretta had made coffee every morning for nearly 3 decades. She had stopped listening to Hollis Tate's voice about 10 minutes in. What she was listening to instead was the sound of her own breathing. Slow, controlled. The same way she had breathed through the worst nights of her career as an Army nurse, when the field was too loud and the decisions came too fast, and the only thing she could hold on to was the rhythm of her own chest rising and falling. Then Hollis Tate said something that made her stop. He was referencing the asset transfers, the LLC restructuring, the careful, methodical movement of shared funds into corporate entities that existed technically before the marriage had formally ended. Loretta had known about some of this. Her own attorney had prepared her. But hearing the timeline spoken aloud in a marble room under slow-moving ceiling fans made something shift inside her chest in a way she had not anticipated. 3 years. Gareth had begun restructuring assets 3 years before filing for divorce. Not in the final months when things had grown cold between them. Not in the year when the conversations had grown shorter and the silences longer, and she had told herself they were simply going through a difficult season. 3 years before he ever said the word divorce out loud, the man across the table had already been building the architecture of a life that did not include her. She looked at him then. He did not look back. She finished signing. When she pushed back her chair and stood, neither Gareth nor Hollis Tate said anything remarkable. Gareth glanced up once briefly, the way a man glances at a door closing in another room. Then he turned back to his papers. Loretta walked out of the Chatham County Courthouse into a morning that smelled like jasmine and rain-wet pavement. The Savannah sky hung low and pale, the kind of sky that cannot decide between clearing and breaking. She crossed the parking lot in her navy coat, and when she reached the old Ford pickup she had driven for 11 years, she opened the passenger door first. Bear was waiting. He was a German shepherd of 8 years, with a thick, dark coat and amber eyes that seemed to carry more awareness than most people Loretta had known. He had been a companion through the last difficult years of the marriage, a presence that asked nothing and gave everything. When Loretta sat down in the driver's seat and did not immediately start the engine, Bear shifted in the passenger seat and placed his head on her arm. She sat there for a moment, just breathing. "It's just paperwork," she said. Bear did not move his head from her arm. She had not cried yet. She was not sure she would. Not because the grief was not real, but because somewhere in the past 2 years, she had spent so much quiet energy preparing herself for this outcome that the tears, if they existed, had no clear moment to arrive. Everything had been absorbed gradually like water into dry ground until there was nothing left to flood. She started the engine. The drive from Savannah to Greystone, North Carolina took 7 hours on roads that grew progressively narrower and older as the Blue Ridge rose ahead of her. Loretta drove north through Georgia and into the Piedmont foothills, with the windows cracked and the radio off. Bear sat upright for the first 2 hours, watching the landscape change from coastal flatland to the darker, older terrain of the southern Appalachians. She had not been to Greystone in 4 years. She had not been to the cabin on Drummond Road since before her father's death, and even then the visits had been brief. Gareth had never liked the mountains. He called the cabin impractical. He called the land inaccessible. He called the whole situation a distraction from their real life in Savannah. Loretta had accepted this for a long time, long enough that she had stopped asking to go. Her father's name had been Silas Drummond. He had died 14 months ago at the age of 88, quietly in the same house where he had lived alone since Loretta's mother passed in 1987. He had been a man of few words and no complaints. He had worked with his hands his entire life, first as a young engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers in the early 1960s, and then after returning to the mountains as a man who fixed things for people without being asked and without sending a bill. Loretta had known the broad outline of his early career: government engineering work, road surveys and structural assessments in remote areas. He had never talked about it in detail, and she had never pressed. There were many things about Silas Drummond that existed in the space between what was said and what was simply understood. She had inherited the cabin because there was no one else to inherit it. The cabin and the 40 acres of Blue Ridge hillside behind it had passed to Loretta through a will so plainly written, it had taken the estate attorney less than 20 minutes to process. Gareth had not fought for the land in the divorce. He had mentioned more than once during the proceedings that she was welcome to keep it. The property was isolated, the structures needed significant repair, the land was steep and not easily developed. He said it easily, almost generously, and at the time she had not understood why. She was beginning to understand now. When the GPS finally directed her off the main highway and onto the series of progressively narrower roads that led to Drummond Road, the afternoon light had started its long lean toward evening. The last 6 miles were unpaved, the truck moving slowly over packed clay and exposed stone roots. The pines pressing in, close on either side, the ridge rising steeply to the left. Bear stood up in the passenger seat as they got close. He pressed his nose to the window. The cabin appeared around a final bend, a low structure of dark timber and fieldstone, set back from the road and half swallowed by the hillside behind it. The porch roof sagged at one end. The windows on the north side had gone gray with age and needed replacing. A rusted rain gutter hung loose from the eave. The garden that Silas had tended every summer for 40 years had gone wild and brown. Loretta sat for a moment with the engine off. She was not returning here to start over. She understood that clearly. She was returning because there was nowhere else to go that made any kind of sense. And because this land had once belonged to a man she had trusted completely, and right now that was the closest thing to solid ground she could find. She opened the truck door. Bear was out before she had both feet on the ground, and instead of circling the yard the way he usually did in a new place, he moved with immediate purpose, straight through the side yard, around the corner of the cabin, toward the hillside behind the house. Loretta watched him disappear into the high grass. She unloaded the truck, carried her bags inside, and spent the first evening doing what she had always done. With physical discomfort, she worked through it. She swept out the main room. She checked the water lines. She got the cast iron stove lit on the third try and sat in front of it until the chill came out of the walls. Bear came back after dark, muddy to his shoulders and settled in front of the stove without any apparent concern. The next 2 days passed in the rhythm of necessary labor. Loretta replaced the loose boards on the front porch. She cleaned out the shed. She patched the north window with plastic sheeting until proper glass could be arranged. She cleared the first section of garden bed and found beneath the weeds soil that was still dark and workable. She did not think much about Savannah. She did not think much about Gareth. She thought about the next thing that needed doing, and then she did it. On the morning of the third day, she was on her knees in the side garden when she noticed that Bear was not beside her. She looked up. The yard was empty. She stood and looked toward the hillside. She could hear him. Not barking, digging, the frantic, committed sound of a day that has decided something is down there and he is going to reach it regardless of how long it takes. Loretta walked through the high grass behind the cabin and up the slope of the hill. She found Bear in a cleared patch of earth about 40 yards from the tree line, both front paws working the ground in a rhythm she recognized as serious. He was not chasing anything. He was not playing. He had found something specific and was going toward it with his whole body. Bear, easy. He paused, looked up at her with those amber eyes, then went straight back to digging. She crouched beside him and used her hands to pull the loose earth back from the edges of what he had exposed. Her fingers found resistance. Not rock, something flat, something geometric. She cleared more dirt away with her palms and felt the cold surface of metal. Then she knocked on it with her knuckle. The sound that came back was not the dull thud of stone or packed earth. It was hollow, deep, the kind of resonance that means there is space beneath. Loretta sat back on her heels and looked at the exposed surface more carefully. She brushed the remaining soil away with the side of her hand, working slowly now, following the edges. The shape that emerged was rectangular. A door. Recessed pull handle set flush with the surface. Steel. Old but solid, fitted into a concrete frame that had been set into the hillside with precision and deliberate permanence. And then in the lower right corner of the door, face half obscured by decades of accumulated grime, a stamped inscription. She leaned close and read it. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And below that, a designation number she did not recognize. And below that, in smaller letters that had worn smooth with time, but remained legible if you looked carefully, Chief Engineer S. Drummond. Loretta did not move for a long moment. S. Drummond, Silas Drummond, her father. Bear sat down beside her, panting, and looked at the door the way dogs look at something they believe they have successfully delivered. She went back to the shed and found a rusted shovel, a pry bar, and her father's old canvas work gloves. She returned to the hillside and spent the next 2 hours clearing the earth from the edges of the door frame. The work was hard. The soil was compressed and root-bound and reluctant, as if it had spent 60 years deciding to keep this particular secret. Her shoulders burned. Her lower back reminded her of her age. Bear helped. He clawed at the packed edges with his front paws whenever she stopped to rest, his whole body committed to the work the way it had been all morning. By midday, the frame was clear. Loretta wedged the pry bar into the seam and applied her weight. Nothing. She repositioned wedge deeper and pushed again with everything she had. The first sound was a groan, then a crack of hardened earth breaking its seal. Then slowly, with the resistance of something that had not moved in a very long time, the door shifted. Cold air rose from below. The smell was particular dry concrete, old dust. Something metallic, the compressed atmosphere of a sealed space that had been breathing its own recycled air since before Loretta was a grown woman. Bear stepped back half a pace but kept his ears sharp and his eyes on the opening. Loretta aimed her flashlight down into the shaft. The beam caught an iron ladder, concrete walls, a gray floor below. She swept the light slowly across the space at the bottom. What she saw was not a storage cellar, not a water tank, not the kind of improvised underground room that mountain people sometimes built for root vegetables and canned goods. What she saw was a room, a proper room, reinforced concrete walls, a metal desk with papers still on it, coated in dust. Wooden crates stacked along one wall, each one stamped with markings she recognized from her years working in veterans' facilities. A large generator under a silver tarp that had long since gone gray. a ventilation pipe running along the ceiling, a shelf of old metal containers sealed with hardware that was military in origin and intention. This had been built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, built to last, built for a purpose that went beyond anything a private citizen would typically undertake in a Blue Ridge hillside. Bear made one low sound and then followed her down the ladder step by careful step, arriving at the concrete floor in a small cloud of rising dust. Loretta moved through the room slowly. She did not touch anything yet. She walked the perimeter with the flashlight, reading the room, the way she had learned to read emergency situations in her nursing years, taking inventory before acting, understanding the full scope before drawing any conclusions. The crates along the wall bore faded stenciling. She knelt and brushed the dust from the nearest one. The letters that emerged were dark against pale wood. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Beneath that, a supply category designation. Beneath that, a date, 1963. She moved to the desk. The documents on its surface were thick with dust, but intact. The dry, sealed air had preserved them in a way that open storage never could have. She lifted the top sheet carefully and found a technical schematic. She moved to the second page, a supply manifest. The third page bore a title in faded block letters. Appalachian Civil Defense Support Site, 1963. She read the first paragraph, then the second. Then she stood very still and read it again. It was what the name suggested. A civil defense installation established during the Cold War at a remote mountain site intended to store emergency supplies, medical equipment, generators, and communications hardware for use in the event of large-scale disaster affecting the mountain communities of western North Carolina. It had been chosen for its isolation, its accessibility to local populations, and the structural integrity of the hillside for underground construction. And it had been signed off at every level of its documented chain of approval by the engineer responsible for its construction and ongoing maintenance. S. Drummond. Loretta pulled out the chair and sat down. The metal was cold through her jeans. She read every page she could reach without moving from the chair. The more she read, the more the shape of her father's life rearranged itself into something she had never been given the full outline of. He had not simply worked a government engineering contract in the early 1960s and then come home. He had built this installation. He had certified it. And then when the program lost its federal funding and the oversight structure dissolved and the paperwork was quietly filed away and forgotten, Silas Drummond had not walked away. He had stayed. The maintenance logs in the lower drawer of the desk told that story clearly. Annual entries in her father's handwriting, updated consistently through the 1970s, the 1980s, and into the 1990s. Generator checks, water tank inspections, ventilation assessments, supply rotation, all of it done by one person without compensation, without acknowledgement, without anyone in Greystone or anywhere else knowing it was happening. Loretta thought about the calluses on her father's hands that had never gone smooth even in his old age. She thought about the mornings when she had woken as a child and found his side of the house empty, and he had come back before breakfast smelling of earth and machine oil and said nothing about where he had been. She thought about the years when she had assumed he was simply the kind of man who kept himself busy because stillness did not suit him. It turned out that stillness had never been the point. The point had been this room, this purpose, this commitment to something larger than himself that he had honored in complete silence for decades because he believed it was the right thing to do and because he did not need anyone to know about it in order to keep doing it. Bear came and settled beside her chair, his warm weight pressing against her leg. In the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath the maintenance logs, beneath a folded topographic map, with her father's pencil annotations along the ridge lines, she found an envelope. Brown paper soft with age. Her name was written on the front in her father's handwriting, the letter slightly slanted and deliberate the way he had always written when he meant something to last. She held it for a moment without opening it. The flashlight beam steadied on the desk. The cold air of the sealed room held its particular silence around her. Bear rested his chin on her foot. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages written in the same careful hand. She recognized the pen, a fountain pen he had kept in the breast pocket of his work shirt for as long as she could remember, the one he used only for things he considered worth the formality. She read the first line, Loretta, if you found this place, it means you came back. And if you came back, it means life took something from you that you thought was everything. I know that feeling. I also know what comes after it if you let it. She stopped reading, not because the words were too much, because she needed a moment to absorb the weight of what they meant. Her father had written this letter knowing she might one day return to this hillside under circumstances like the one she was now living. He had written it knowing the kind of man Gareth Vane was. He had written it knowing that his daughter might need one day the thing he had left buried here. And he had left it anyway. Not as a rescue, not as a solution, as a foundation. She sat in the Cold War bunker her father had kept for decades under a Blue Ridge hillside with her German shepherd warm against her foot and the mountain quiet above them. And she read the rest of the letter slowly in the beam of the flashlight, alone with everything her father had never said out loud while he was alive to say it. Outside, the afternoon had deepened into early evening. The pines on the hillside moved in a slow wind. The cabin below was dark. But down here in the room that Silas Drummond had built and kept and left for her, there was something Loretta had not felt since before the divorce proceedings began, before the long, slow unraveling of a life she had believed was solid. There was the feeling of ground beneath her feet, real ground, the kind no one could take away in a courthouse, the kind that had been waiting here patient and prepared for exactly as long as it needed to wait. Bear looked up at her. I know, she said quietly. He knew we'd come back. She folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat close to her chest. Then she took a long, slow breath of cold mountain air and began for the first time since Savannah to think about what came next. The letter was 2 pages long, but Silas Drummond had never been a man who wasted words. Loretta read it twice in the bunker that first evening, sitting at the metal desk with the flashlight angled against the wall, and Bear curled at her feet. Then she carried it upstairs, made a fire in the cast iron stove, and read it a third time in the cabin by firelight, with a cup of black coffee going cold on the table beside her. Her father wrote the way he had lived, plainly, without ornament, every sentence placed where it was needed and not one word further. He wrote that he had volunteered to remain as caretaker of the installation after the federal program dissolved in 1968, when the other engineer had moved on to new assignments, and the paperwork had been quietly filed into a system that no longer had anyone paying attention to it. He wrote that he had made this decision alone without telling anyone because he believed the mountain communities around Greystone would face serious emergencies in the years ahead, and that a prepared shelter maintained and stocked was worth more than any explanation he might owe the world for keeping it secret. He wrote about the storms, the ice storm of 1978 that had cut Greystone off from the county road for 11 days, the flooding in 1993 that had taken the low ground near the creek and left 3 families without homes through the winter. He had watched all of it from this hillside, and he had maintained the bunker through all of it, always believing that the right moment to open it would come, and then the right moment would pass, and he would go back down the ladder and check the generator again and wait. He wrote that he had not told Loretta because she had been young when this responsibility had settled onto him, and he had not wanted to transfer the weight of it before she was ready to choose it for herself. And then she had grown up and moved to Savannah and built a life there, and the years had accumulated the way years do, and the telling had never found its right time. Then he wrote about Gareth. Loretta set down her coffee when she reached that section. Her father had met Gareth Vane once before the wedding at a dinner in Savannah in 1994 that Loretta still remembered clearly. Silas had been quiet through most of it, watching more than participating. Afterward, he had said only that Gareth seemed like a man who was always calculating something. Loretta had taken it as her father's general skepticism of men who wore expensive suits and talked easily about money. She had not taken it as a warning. In the letter, her father wrote that he had noticed the way Gareth looked at the Greystone land that night when Loretta had mentioned inheriting it. Not the casual interest of a man hearing about property, the specific attention of a man who already knew something about the property in question. He had not said anything then. He had hoped he was wrong. He wrote, "I was not wrong, but I also did not tell you, and that is something I have to ask your forgiveness for. You loved him. I could see that. And I was afraid that what I had to say would cost you something you had chosen freely, and I did not believe it was my right to take that from you. I think now that I was wrong about that too. Some things should be said regardless of the cost." Loretta put the letter down. She sat with that for a long time. Outside the Blue Ridge, dark had settled fully over the hillside. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. Bear lifted his head from the floor, looked at her steadily, then rested it again. She was not angry at her father. She understood him too well to be angry. Silas Drummond had spent his entire life carrying things quietly, believing that silence was a form of protection, that the people you loved were better served by what you did than by what you said. He had been wrong about Gareth. He had been wrong about the silence. But he had also left her the letter, the bunker, the land, the careful record of everything he had built and maintained alone. And in the leaving of it, he had said everything he had never managed to say while he was alive. She went to bed that night with the letter on the nightstand and Bear on the floor beside her. She slept better than she had in 2 years. The town of Greystone had a single main street, a post office that shared its building with a small insurance agency, a diner called Patton's that had operated under the same family name since 1962, and a hardware and general supply store run by a woman named Nadine Pruitt. Loretta drove down on the fourth morning to buy Nails motor oil, a new hinge set for the cabin's back door, and enough dry goods to last her another 2 weeks. She parked the truck in front of Pruitt's and went inside with Bear walking at her heel. Nadine Pruitt was somewhere in her late 50s, with short, gray streaked hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the unhurried confidence of a woman who had been running this particular room for a long time. She looked up when Loretta came in and did what people in small mountain towns always do. She assessed before she spoke. "You're Silas Drummond's daughter," she said. "Not a question." "I am Parabana Pam Sonanet Andahan," Loretta said. Nadine came around this counter and extended her hand. Her grip was firm and brief. "Nadine Pruitt, I knew your father well enough to know I didn't know him as well as I thought." She said it without irony as a simple fact. "He fixed our water pump the winter of '98 when the freeze took out the main line. Came up the hill in the middle of a storm, did the work, and was gone before I could get him a cup of coffee. Never sent a bill." "That sounds right," Loretta said. Nadine studied her for a moment with the directness of someone who has learned to read people quickly and accurately. "You staying for now?" "Good." Nadine turned back toward the counter. "What do you need?" They worked through the supply list together, and while Nadine pulled items from the shelves, she talked about Greystone with the easy fluency of someone reading from memory. The road washout from last October that still had not been fully repaired. The family down by the creek that had finally sold their bottom acreage. The fact that the county emergency management office had not updated its equipment or protocols in 11 years. Loretta listened and did not yet say anything about what Bear had found on the hillside behind the cabin. 2 days after her visit to Pruitt's, the rain came in hard from the west. It started mid-morning and was serious by noon, the kind of Blue Ridge rain that moves in sheets and turns the creek sounds into something you can hear from inside the cabin. Loretta was replacing the back door hinge when Bear suddenly left her side and went to the window, ears sharp, body still. She put down the screwdriver. Bear moved to the front door and stood there. "What is it?" He looked back at her once, then at the door again. She opened it. He was gone into the rain before she could say anything else. She pulled on her coat and followed. She found him at the edge of the tree line on the north side of the property, standing very still, looking into the brush. She came up beside him, and then she heard a sound that did not belong to the rain or the wind or the creek running fast below the hill. A child crying, not far, maybe 30 yards into the trees where the ground dropped toward the stream. She pushed through the wet brush with Bear moving ahead of her and found him on the near bank of the creek, a small boy of about 7 years old, knees muddy face white with cold, and fear, one sneaker missing. He had been crying for a while. His voice had gone thin. Bear reached him first. He sat down directly in front of the boy, without rushing close enough to be warm, far enough not to frighten. The boy looked at the dog for one long second and then leaned into him with his whole body the way children lean into things that feel safe. His name was Ezra Aldridge. He had come into the woods with his older brother to look for mushrooms after school and had gotten separated when the rain came in fast. He did not know how long he had been walking. He was cold, and he had twisted his ankle on a root, and he was 7 years old and alone in the woods in a rainstorm. Loretta knelt down, checked his ankle with practiced hands, determined it was sore, but not damaged, and wrapped her coat around his shoulders. She carried him on her back the quarter-mile to the road where she flagged down a passing truck, whose driver recognized the boy immediately. By the time they reached the Aldridge house at the edge of town, Ezra's mother was already outside in the rain. She held Ezra for a long time. Then she looked at Loretta and could not immediately find words. Bear found him, Loretta said simply. Ezra, still wrapped in Loretta's coat and now considerably less frightened, looked down at Bear and said with the direct clarity that 7-year-olds sometimes produce, "He just sat down in front of me and I wasn't scared anymore." Greystone knew Loretta's name by the following morning. She had been back at Pruitt's for additional supplies 3 days later, when Nadine set down the items she was pricing and looked at her with a different quality of attention than before. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Nadine said, "about this land of yours." Loretta waited. Nadine pulled a stool from behind the counter and sat on it, which indicated the conversation was going to take some time. Back in 1989, there was a development company came through this county, big operation out of Atlanta, called themselves Harwick Development. They were buying up mountain property, or trying to. Said they had infrastructure contracts with the state. "I've heard of that kind of operation," Loretta said. "They approached your father about the Drummond land," Nadine said. "Not once. Several times over the course of about 2 years. He refused every time. The last time their representative came up here, your father met him on the porch and said nothing except that the land was not for sale and would not be for sale, and that he would not be answering the door again on this subject." Nadine paused. The man respected it eventually. They moved on. Loretta said nothing, already sensing where this was going. "The reason I'm telling you this now," Nadine continued, "is that 2 weeks ago I was talking to my cousin over in Asheville, who keeps up with commercial real estate, and she mentioned that Harwick Development, or what's left of it after a series of mergers, currently has a man named Gareth Vane sitting on its advisory board." The hardware store was very quiet. "He's been on that board for 6 years, Nadine said, "which means when Harwick was going through its acquisition records during the merger, he would have had access to every property file they ever compiled, including the ones from 1989. She met Loretta's eyes directly, "Including yours." Loretta stood very still. The arithmetic of it assembled itself without effort. Gareth had joined the Harwick Advisory Board 6 years ago. The divorce proceedings had begun 3 years ago. The quiet transfer of assets had begun 3 years ago. He had known about the Drummond land from the Harwick files, had known there was something about that property that the company had wanted badly enough to pursue for 2 years, and he had understood that whatever it was worth more than any Savannah asset he might otherwise contest in a divorce settlement. He had not fought for the land in court because he had another approach in mind, a slower one, a more patient one. She thought about her father's letter. "I noticed the way he looked at the Greystone land that night." That dinner had been in 1994, the year before the wedding. She had been 36 years old and building a life she believed in, and she had not seen any of it. She drove back up the mountain in silence. Bear sat upright in the passenger seat and watched the road. The black SUV appeared on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Loretta had come back to Greystone. She was in the garden, setting wire support frames for the bean rows she had planted along the south-facing slope when Bear stopped what he was doing and turned his head toward the road. He got to his feet without urgency, but with complete attention, the fur along his spine rising in a way that was not aggression, but was absolutely a statement. The SUV came slowly up the packed clay road, its tires too wide and too expensive for the terrain. It parked at the edge of the yard. Gareth stepped out. He wore a light jacket and clean trousers and shoes that had never been meant for mountain property. He looked around the yard with an expression Loretta recognized immediately because she had watched it form across 30 years. The look he wore when he was assessing something, measuring its dimensions against what he already knew. She set down the wire frame and waited. He came to the edge of the garden and stopped there, which was as far as Bear's posture suggested he should come. He looked at the repaired porch, the new hingework on the back door, the cleared garden beds, the stacked firewood along the north wall. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he had once dismissed and is now being forced to recalibrate. Loretta. Gareth. A pause. He removed his sunglasses. You've done more here than I expected. You didn't come here to tell me that. He accepted the correction without arguing. I've been hearing things about this property, he said. There are people saying you found something, right? On the hillside. People talk, she said. He kept his voice even the way he kept it even in negotiations. Loretta, I'm going to be straight with you. That would be a change. Something moved across his face, an awareness of how certain things sounded when said out loud in the daylight. He looked at her for a moment, then at the cabin, and she could see him adjusting the way a man adjusts when he realizes the person across from him has already read the documents he thought were hidden. Then he said it. I knew about this land before I knew you. The Blue Ridge morning held its silence around them. A crow called somewhere in the upper pines. Bear had not moved. I know you did, Loretta said. That surprised him. She could see it, the small recalibration behind his eyes. The Harwick files, he said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. Then in a voice that had lost some of its negotiating weight, 29 years, Loretta, I stayed 29 years. You did. Doesn't that mean something? She looked at him the way you look at a room you have already moved out of. Every object familiar. None of it yours anymore. It means something, she said, but it doesn't change what you built underneath it. Gareth tightened his jaw. There may be legal considerations here that you aren't equipped to handle alone. If there's federal infrastructure involved, historical designation, any kind of government interest. Gareth, he stopped. I spent 22 years managing logistics for a veterans hospital, she said. I have read every document in that installation. I know exactly what is there and what it means and what the legal framework around it is. She paused. I don't need your help. I don't want your help. And this conversation is finished. Bear took one step forward, just one, but it was enough. Gareth stood at the garden's edge a moment longer. Then he put his sunglasses back on. You'll be hearing from Hollis, he said. I expect so, she said. He walked back to the SUV and did not look back. The tires moved slowly over the packed clay, and the sound of the engine faded down through the pines, and then the road was quiet again. Loretta stood in the garden for a long moment after the sound was gone. Her hands were perfectly steady. Bear came and pressed his shoulder against her leg, and she reached down and set her hand on his back, feeling the warmth of him and the solid reality of the hillside around her and the cabin behind her and 40 acres of Blue Ridge land beneath her feet that had been in her family for 60 years and would not be leaving it. She looked up at the hill. Somewhere behind her, under the earth, a generator was waiting to run again. She had work to do. The notice arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under the cabin door sometime before Loretta was up. She found it when she opened the front door to let Bear out into the early gray light. A single page folded in thirds on county letterhead. She stood on the porch in her work boots and read it while the mist moved through the upper pines, and Bear made his first circuit of the yard below. The language was administrative and careful. An inspection team from the Greystone County Office of Historical and Community Infrastructure would be visiting the Drummond property within 10 days showed to assess an underground structure of potential historical significance. The visit was described as routine. The tone was neutral. She read it twice, folded it along its original creases, and went inside to make coffee. She was not afraid of an inspection. She had nothing to hide and everything to show. But she understood immediately, and without any particular bitterness, that this document had not originated in the county administrator's office. It had originated with Hollis Tate, who had found a legal mechanism that did not require Gareth to make any direct claim. It only required the introduction of uncertainty, a process, a series of questions that might produce enough bureaucratic friction to make Loretta doubt whether the ground beneath her feet was really as solid as she believed. It was a patient approach. It was exactly the kind of approach Gareth would favor. She poured her coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and began making a list. The preparation took 6 days. Loretta worked the way she had always worked under pressure, which was systematically and without wasted motion. She had spent 2 decades as a logistics coordinator at a veterans hospital. She understood documentation. She understood the difference between what was true and what was provable, and she understood that in any formal process, the latter was the only currency that mattered. She began with the legal foundation. The cabin and the 40 acres of Drummond land had passed to her through a will that had been probated without contest. She had the original deed, the inheritance certificate, and the county tax records going back 30 years. The land was hers. That part was simple. The bunker required more care. She spent 2 full days going through every document on the metal desk, and in the filing cabinet, she found behind the generator, working through the dust and the cold air, with a legal pad beside her, and Bear sleeping against the base of the desk. She read maintenance logs, technical schematics, supply manifests, and interagency correspondence from the early 1960s. And then on the afternoon of the second day, in a cardboard folder tucked behind the filing cabinet at an angle that suggested it had slid there accidentally, sometime in the past several decades, she found something she had not known to look for. The folder contained a single document, 4 pages typed on government letterhead dated 1991. It bore her father's signature at the bottom of the final page alongside the signature of the Greystone County Administrator of that year, a man named Harold Birch, whose name she recognized from a photograph on the wall of Patton's Diner, commemorating some county civic event from that era. She read it carefully, then she read it again. It was a formal registration. In 1991, Silas Drummond had submitted a petition to the county to officially designate the underground installation as a community emergency shelter under North Carolina's civil preparedness statutes. He had included documentation of the facility's construction standards, its supply inventory, its ventilation and power systems, and its capacity. Harold Birch had reviewed it and signed off. The registration had been processed and filed. It had simply never been publicized, never announced, never entered into any of the more visible county records that a developer's attorney might find with a standard search. Silas Drummond had registered this shelter 23 years before Gareth Vane ever sat down on the Harwick Development Advisory Board. The legal framework had existed quiet and complete the entire time. Loretta set the document down on the desk and looked at Bear. "He thought of everything," she said. Bear raised his eyebrows in the way German shepherds have of suggesting they are following the conversation. She made careful copies of the registration document, the original deed, the Corps of Engineers installation records, and the maintenance logs. She organized them into a binder with a plain cover and labeled each section in the clear block print she had used on hospital paperwork for 2 decades. She took photographs of the bunker itself and printed them at the pharmacy in town. Then she called Nadine. Nadine Pruitt arrived the next morning in her red pickup with two men from town she introduced as brothers Walt and Gene Osgood, who worked in construction and had offered to come without being asked twice. She also brought a supply list she had apparently been composing in her head for some time, written on the back of a hardware invoice. When Loretta led them out to the hillside and opened the steel door, Nadine stood at the top of the shaft for a long moment, looking down at the concrete room below. She was quiet in a way that suggested genuine reckoning with something unexpected. "Your father hid an entire piece of history beneath his feet," she said finally. "He kept it," Loretta said. "There's a difference." They worked for 3 days. Walt and Gene reinforced the ladder railing and resealed two sections of the ventilation pipe. Nadine reorganized the supply area with the efficiency of a woman who had been running a storeroom her entire working life, clearing out anything expired and creating a clean inventory of what remained serviceable. Loretta handled the electrical system, replacing fuses and testing circuits with the methodical patience of someone who had learned early that shortcuts in infrastructure work had consequences that arrived at the worst possible times. On the second evening, the generator ran for the first time in longer than anyone could verify. The sound it made was deep and industrial and slightly startling in the enclosed space, and the lights along the ceiling flickered twice and then held steady, and the four of them stood in the underground room looking at each other in the yellow light with the satisfaction of people who have done something genuinely useful. Bear moved between each of them as they worked, checking on the progress with the attentive thoroughness of a supervisor who takes the job seriously. Word of the preparations moved through Greystone the way all information moved through small mountain towns, which was to say immediately and without any assistance from the people involved. By the end of the week, 3 more people had driven up the mountain road to offer contributions. A retired paramedic named Douglas Hale brought 2 trauma kits and a portable oxygen unit. A woman named Bette Quarles brought a handwritten list of the 14 residents in the area who had medical conditions that would require specific attention in an emergency. A teenager came up one afternoon with his father and asked if they needed help carrying anything. They did, and he worked without complaint for 4 hours. Loretta accepted all of it with the same steady practicality with which she had approached every other part of this process. The night before the inspection, she sat at the kitchen table with the documentation binder open in front of her, going through it one final time. Bear was on the floor by the stove. She checked every section, every page, every photograph, the way she had once checked patient charts before a shift change, making certain that everything that needed to be there was there and nothing was out of sequence. She was closing the binder when she heard the engine. Bear heard it first. He was at the door before the sound had resolved into something identifiable. Loretta looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 9 in the evening. She opened the door. The black SUV sat at the edge of the yard with its engine off. Then the door opened and Gareth stepped out, and Loretta noticed immediately the things that were different from his last visit. No jacket, a plain collared shirt untucked. He looked older in the yard light than he had in the garden 3 weeks ago. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well. He did not come to the porch. He stopped at the edge of the yard and stood there with his hands at his sides. Bear moved to the top of the porch steps and sat down. Gareth looked at the yost, then up at Loretta. "I'm not here with Hollis," he said. "I can see that." A long pause. He looked at the cabin, at the repaired porch boards, at the firewood stacked along the wall, at all the evidence of the work she had done since coming back. When he finally looked at her again, the assessment was gone from his face. What was there instead was harder to name and more honest than anything she had seen from him in years. "I stayed 29 years, he said. The same words as before, but without the negotiating weight behind them this time. He was not deploying them as an argument. He was simply saying them the way a man says something true that doesn't help him. Loretta waited. Some of it was real. He paused, and she could see him working to say the next part without calculation, which was not a thing that came naturally to him. "The summer we drove up the coast and the car broke down in that town in South Carolina. The night your father called and I drove you there without asking any questions. Those things were real, Loretta. I want you to know I know the difference. The ridge wind moved through the yard. Somewhere down the hill, the creek was running high from the week's rain. Loretta looked at him for a long time. She thought about the dinner in 1994 when her father had watched Gareth across a restaurant table and seen something she had not been able to see. She thought about 29 years of a life she had built in good faith, and she thought about how the real moments and the calculated ones had existed side by side all that time, and how the hardest thing was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that she could not simply erase the real parts to make the grief cleaner. I know some of it was real, she said quietly. That's the part that took the longest to grieve. He absorbed that without defending himself, which was perhaps the most decent thing she had seen him do. I made choices I can't undo, he said. No, she said. You can't. Another silence. Gareth looked down at the ground between them, and for the first time in the years she had known him, he appeared to have nothing left to say, no secondary position, no alternative approach. The conversation had arrived somewhere that his particular skills had no tools for, and he seemed to understand that clearly. I'll tell Hollis to withdraw the inspection request, he said. Don't, Loretta said. He looked up. Let them come, she said. I have nothing to hide and everything is in order. Let them see it. She paused. That's how my father handled Harwick Development in 1989. He didn't run from the process. He let the process run its course because he knew the ground he was standing on. Gareth was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across his face that she might in a different life have called respect. He was a hard man to get around your father. Yes, Loretta said, he was. Gareth nodded once slowly. He looked at the cabin one more time, as if releasing something he had held too long. Then he walked back to the SUV and got in and started the engine and backed slowly down the mountain road. Loretta stood on the porch and watched until the headlights disappeared through the pines. The feeling that moved through her then was not triumph and it was not grief. It was something quieter than both. The specific stillness of a door that has finally properly closed. She looked down at Bear. Good boy, she said. He came and leaned his head against her hand, and she held it there for a moment in the cold night air before going back inside. The inspection team arrived at 10 the following morning. 2 people from the county historical office and 1 representative from the community safety division. A composed woman named Patricia Odom, who carried a clipboard and asked direct questions and wrote down the answers with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work long enough to know the difference between a problem and a situation that had been managed responsibly. Nadine was already there when they arrived, standing near the base of the cabin steps with her arms folded. Loretta had asked her to come, and Nadine had arrived 20 minutes early, which was exactly what Loretta had expected. Loretta led the team down the ladder with the lights already running and the generator humming steadily. She walked them through each section of the bunker. She showed them the Corps of Engineers installation records, the maintenance logs, and her father's handwriting, spanning 3 decades, the 1991 registration document with Harold Birch's signature. She showed them the current supply inventory, the medical stores, the repaired ventilation system, the tested electrical circuits. Patricia Odom asked careful questions about ownership continuity, about the gap between the 1963 construction and the 1991 registration, about the current maintenance protocols Loretta had established. Loretta answered each question with the documentation already organized to support it. There were no surprises on either side. The inspection took 2 hours. When they climbed back to the surface, Patricia Odom stood on the hillside in the thin autumn light and reviewed her notes. Then she closed her clipboard and looked at Loretta directly. The property ownership is clear, she said. The 1991 registration is valid and has never been superseded. The facility's current condition reflects consistent and competent maintenance. She paused. Using this installation as a community emergency shelter is entirely within your legal rights, and frankly, given what we've just seen, It would be a significant community asset to do so. She added after a brief pause, "In 20 years of this work, I have not often seen a privately maintained historical installation in this condition. Your father was a careful man." "He was," Loretta said, after the inspection team had driven back down the mountain. Nadine stood beside Loretta on the hillside and looked out over the ridge for a long moment without speaking. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced two slightly battered granola bars, offered one to Loretta without ceremony, and they stood there on the hillside eating them, while Bear investigated the area around the hatch with the thorough attention he gave to anything he considered his professional responsibility. The first heavy snow came in the second week of November. Loretta woke to a white yard and a sky the color of pewter, and Bear standing at the front door with his full attention on the road below. She made coffee and stood on the porch watching the snow come down in the silence that only accumulates when the ground is covered and the trees are muffled and the world has temporarily reduced itself to what is immediately visible. By midday, the county had lost power across most of the ridge. By 2 in the afternoon, Nadine had called twice, and Betta Quarles had called once, and Douglas Hale had sent a message that read, "Only people asking about the shelter." Loretta was already on her way to open the hatch. She started the generator and checked the lights and the heat coils and the water supply. She brought down 4 additional blankets from the cabin and the full medical kit in a large pot of soup she had made on the cast iron stove while there was still enough wood heat to manage it. Bear stationed himself at the base of the ladder and seemed to understand his assignment without being told. They came up the mountain road in ones and twos through the falling snow. The Aldrich family arrived first with Ezra wrapped in a wool blanket. He went down the ladder without hesitation, with the confidence of a child who has been somewhere twice and now considers it familiar territory. The elderly Croft couple from the low ground near the creek, a young woman named Sarah with a toddler on her hip, who had moved to Greystone 8 months ago and did not yet know everyone but had heard about the shelter from Bet's phone tree. Douglas Hale with his medical kits and his quiet professional manner. Nadine with a cardboard box of food supplies that she had apparently been staging in her truck for exactly this kind of evening. 11 people in total plus Bear in a concrete room under a Blue Ridge hillside that Silas Drummond had built in 1963 and maintained alone for decades, registered with the county in 1991, and left to his daughter in a letter that began with the words, "If you came back, it means you're ready." Loretta moved through the room the way she had moved through hospital wards for 20 years, checking on the Croft couple, making sure their medications were accounted for, helping Sarah settle the toddler on a folded blanket near the warmest wall, talking Douglas through the arrangement of the medical supplies so that everything was accessible in the order it was most likely to be needed. At some point in the middle of the evening, she looked across the room and stopped. Ezra Aldridge had arranged himself in the corner nearest the supply shelves with a flashlight and a book he had carried down in his backpack. He was reading aloud in a low, careful voice, sounding out the longer words with the concentration of a child who is still making friends with reading. Bear lay stretched out beside him, so close that Ezra's shoulder rested against the dog's side. Every so often, Bear's ear would swivel toward the sound of Ezra's voice, and Ezra, noticing this, would look over and say something to the dog in a tone too quiet for Loretta to catch, and then go back to his page. It was such a complete and ordinary thing, a child and a dog in a warm room on a winter night, that the fullness of it took a moment to reach her. This was what the bunker had been built for. Not the generator or the supply manifests or the civil defense designations. This, a child reading in safety while the snow came down outside. Nadine came to stand beside her at some point in the late evening. They stood together looking at the room at the yellow light and the small sounds of people settled and warm and not afraid. "Your father would have called this a normal Tuesday," Nadine said. Loretta almost smiled. "He called most things normal. It was how he got through them." "How do you call it?" Loretta thought about the question. She thought about the courthouse in Savannah and the drive north through the Piedmont and the cold first night in a cabin with a damp floor and a stove that needed 3 tries. She thought about a letter in a brown envelope in a desk drawer under a hillside written by a man who had spent his whole life doing necessary things without explanation and leaving behind as his final act the one explanation that mattered most. "I call it what he built it for," she said. The power came back to Greystone sometime before dawn. People climbed the ladder one by one into a cleared, cold morning with fresh snow on the ground and a sky that had gone from pewter to pale blue. They thanked Loretta with the directness of people who mean it and are not practiced at elaborate expressions of gratitude, which was the kind of thanks she had always found easiest to receive. Ezra was the last child up the ladder. He turned at the top and looked back down into the bunker, committing something to memory the way children do when they understand that a place matters. Then he looked at Bear, who had come up beside him. "Will it be here next time?" he asked. "Yes," Loretta said. "It'll be here." He nodded satisfied and followed his mother toward the road. Loretta pulled the steel door closed and stood for a moment on the hillside. The morning was very still. The snow on the ground was unmarked beyond the tracks leading back toward the cabin, and the ridge to the west was sharp and clean against the blue. Bear sat beside her, looking at the same view, his thick winter coat making him look solid and permanent as the hill itself. She thought about her father standing on the same hillside in the mornings, in all the seasons she had not been here to see, carrying the weight of something no one else knew about, and not asking for recognition because the work itself was sufficient reason. She thought about what it meant to love something that way, through decades of quiet, consistent, unglamorous maintenance, never knowing exactly when it would matter, but knowing that it would. She understood him better now than she ever had when he was alive. She reached down and set her hand on Bear's back, feeling the steady warmth of him. She had come back to this mountain expecting to simply wait out what remained of her life in some form of acceptable silence. She had arrived with 2 suitcases in the particular exhaustion of a person who has been diminished slowly enough that they did not notice how far down they had come until they were standing in a courthouse parking lot with nothing left to sign. What she had found instead was this: not wealth, not vindication, not the satisfaction of watching Gareth Vane face consequences in any dramatic or visible way. None of those things. What she had found was simpler and more durable than any of them. She had found the ground her father had prepared for her. She had found the community that remembered his name with the warmth reserved for people who give without accounting. She had found the work that needed doing and the capacity still in her hands and her body and her mind to do it. She had found at 65 years old, on a Blue Ridge hillside in November, that she was not the remnant of a life that had come apart. She was the keeper of something. She turned and walked back toward the cabin through the clean snow, her boots leaving steady tracks across the white yard, the Blue Ridge morning opening around her in all directions wide and cold and full of light.